We discussed and reflected on Russia's future, and it's an honor to have him here, Michael Kofman, Russian military expert. Michael, you said that within 5 to 7 years, Russia will strengthen and rebuild its military. So how can Europe prepare?
Thank you. So to clarify, first, it's not clear that something that Russia can do in 5 to 7 years. That's a very conservative estimate based on maybe where Russia is in the war today. There's a lot of debates on whether or not sanctions and export controls will really constrain Russia's ability to rebuild particularly more advanced military technologies. And also, this war could advance Russian military power much more so. But it is much safer to assume that the Russian military will reconstitute itself in some period of time. Maybe it'll be 7 years, maybe it'll longer. But more often than not, it tends to be in a shorter amount of time than people typically anticipate, because Russia still has a considerable amount of latent power. It has a lot of equipment, it has resources and manpower. And so how should Europe prepare? It's very important, I think, that European colleagues don't walk away with a misperceived notion of this conflict. The first is the idea that Russian forces perform much more poorly than I think many had anticipated. And so that means that a war with Russia would be not only much easier, but that European countries themselves could easily handle it, or that investment in defense, particularly national defense, isn't as important. Actually, this war in many ways tells something different. Yes, the Russian military has performed a lot worse than many expected, but military power is very context dependent, right? That is very much about the conditions, the war, the actors involved. And the truth is that this war shows a lot that war is fundamentally about the ability of force, especially in conventional conflict, to replace losses of manpower, material, ammunition, and about the capacity for states to engage in force employment on a much larger scale, right? And the question is, can European nations really do that? Do European nations have the defense capacity and industrial capacity to be able to engage in conventional conflict in Europe? And the truth is that even just looking at the weapons that European states have already supplied to Ukraine, it'll take years for Europe to reconstitute those capabilities that they have, let alone further develop and invest into the kind of capabilities they would need to deal with a Russian military in the future. Russia has reconstituted itself some years down the line. And folks listening to this should keep in mind, 5, 7 years, in terms of defense strategy, this is the blink of an eye. It'll go by very, very quickly, right? It's not something that's very far on the horizon. This is actually pretty much near term when it comes to defense planning.
And how should Europe deal with Russia right now?
So at the very minimum, Europe needs to maintain a consensus regarding sanctions, export controls, and providing military equipment, in particular ammunition, to Ukraine, but also economic assistance, where I think Europe has to an extent been a laggard relative to the economic resources that this continent has, right? And when it comes to dealing with Russia, well, I think there is a fair consensus in Europe, although views vary, but that this war needs to end with some kind of a strategic defeat for Russia, right? And what the end state looks like, probably perspectives maybe vary between different European states. But one way or another, you have to appreciate the fact that Europe at this stage is host to what is essentially the largest interstate conventional war, right, where Russia very clearly is the aggressor. And this war is very far from over, right? And so we can't just have a conversation about how Europe should deal with Russia without also acknowledging the fact that we're in the midst of a major conventional conflict playing out on the European continent.
Michael, thank you very much.